Katrina Walser from All Fun Cat, and if we haven't met before, I am a knitting teacher and designer based in Sydney in Australia. And today I have a tutorial for you on how to knit stripes. So, if you saw my video diary a couple of weeks ago, you'll know that I don't love doing stranded colour work. I find it a little bit complicated, but I do still really love doing a particular type of colour work called slip stitch knitting, which is gaining popularity these days. It's become quite prominent, especially with some of Stephen West's designs, and so I thought I'd do a tutorial on how that works. And essentially what slip stitch knitting is fancy stripes. It's just a series of stripes that you do some particular things with some of the stitches too, and it comes out with all these brilliant colour work patterns and looks. But I figured that before we talked about all of that, it would be good to go back to the basics and start talking about how you knit stripes in the first place. If you are a more advanced knitter and you've been doing stripes and things for years, feel free to skip this and just go straight on to the actual slip stitch tutorial, which will be up next week. But if you are more of a beginner knitter or even an intermediate one who hasn't done a lot of striped work before, then watch on and I'll explain to you how to actually knit stripes and how to join the yarn and things like that. And then we'll come back at the end and have a bit of a chat about what you can do with stripes aside from just making stripy pieces. Okay, so here's the swatch that we're going to be working with. I just went ahead and cast on in the first colour and then knit a few rows of stockinette. And now I want to add on the second colour and start my stripes. So the way that I do this is I grab the tail of the second colour and I pull it so that it's underneath the first colour. And then I grab the end of it and fold it back over the top. And that way you have a little loop of the second colour with the first colour trapped inside of the loop. And then pull that to the back of your work and hold this a little tightly for the first couple of stitches. So just make sure you pull this tight and then start knitting with the second colour held double for a couple of stitches. So I usually do it for 4. And what that actually does is that it weaves in the tail of the second colour for you. So at the end of your work, you don't have to weave that tail in anymore. One thing to note is that when you do this, the first stitch can look either like it's just made up of the first colour or that it's this funny stitch that's made up of 2 colours. But the way you get around that is you just pull on the tail of the first colour and that'll fix it up. Okay, so once you've joined on your ball, you just use the new colour and knit all the way to the end. And once you've gotten to the end, it looks like this. And so you just turn around and go back the other way. And just make sure when you get to the stitches where you're holding the tail double, that you treat these sort of doubled up stitches as just one stitch. Don't accidentally work them as 2 separate stitches. And so when you're done, it looks like this on the right side and this on the wrong side. And one thing you'll notice is that on the wrong side, it has these funny little bumps where the colours are sort of intermingled with each other. And so this is what it looks like whenever you change colours and there is a purl stitch involved. So if you're following a pattern, just follow whatever the pattern says. But if you're just doing it yourself and you're trying to add stripes to an existing pattern, my big tip is only add stripes to stockinette stitch. There are methods of getting rid of those purl bumps, but that's a little bit beyond the scope of this video. So when you get to the end, you'll have the first colour sitting at the bottom and the second colour sitting at the top. And my big tip, if there's one thing you come away from this video remembering, is don't cut the strands. When you're knitting stripes, I've seen a lot of beginners think that they have to cut the strands every time they change colors. There's no reason to cut the old color off. So what you actually do is, if you are going to keep knitting or working in the second color, you take the ball and you move it so that it's underneath the first color and then put it back over the top again. And so that introduces this like twist into the strands, and I'll show you why that is important in a sec. So I'm going to go ahead and just knit the rest of this blue stripe, and I'll show you why we did that twist thing when I'm finished. So we're coming up to the end of the row, and so if you look at the wrong side of the work, take a look really carefully at what this dark blue is doing. By twisting the strands around each other at the start of the previous right side row, what's happened is that you've trapped the dark blue strand into the light blue strand. And what that does is that it actually, the term is carries. It carries the color that you're not using up the side with you, so that whenever you're ready to use it again, it's right there, ready to go. At the top of your work, you haven't left it down here. So if you want to then add in a third color, you take the end of the ball, you run it underneath the first two colors, and then fold it over, knit with the tail held together for a couple of stitches. And whenever you do this, make sure you pull this a little tightly. And then knit, knit, knit for about 4 stitches. Well, 3 in my case because I made the tail too short. And then you knit to the end of the row. And then once you get to the end of the wrong side row, again, to twist the strands around, just always pretend like the other colors that you're not using are one strand. So pull the ball underneath and then put it over the top. And that'll carry these yarns up the side with you. And you can obviously add as many colors as you like. The only thing is that it eventually becomes a little unwieldy having so many balls attached to your work. At that point, if it is getting too annoying to have all of these balls hanging around on your knitting, you can start cutting strands if they're ones that you aren't using too often. And alternatively, if you have really thick stripes and you aren't going to be using a particular color for a while, that's also a case where you can cut a strand. But if you are alternating colors pretty frequently, I would really recommend carrying the strands up the side so you don't have a million tails to weave in at the end. And so that's it. There's our little stripy piece. So I hope that was helpful and you have a better understanding now of how to actually knit stripes and start them off. A couple of things I wanted to point out. So first off, the tutorial that I just showed you is about how to knit stripes flat. And you can also knit stripes in the round, but it does have a couple of pros and cons that I wanted to warn you about and let you know about. So the main advantage of knitting stripes in the round is that you have finer control about how thick they are. So when you knit flat, because you are knitting with one strand on the right side and then turning it over and knitting with that strand again, going back the other way on the wrong side, the thinnest stripe you can make is 2 rows tall because you go one way and then back again, and then you can switch colors. But when you're knitting in the round, because there is only a right side and you're just going round and around in a circle, you can actually have stripes that are only 1 row tall because you just go from the beginning of the round to the end of the round and then you switch colors and then go again. And so your stripes can be quite a bit thinner. So it's nice having a finer amount of control. But the big gotcha with knitting stripes in the round is that the end of your stripe is always a little higher than the beginning of the stripe. And so there are some techniques that you can use to combat that. The 2 methods you can look up for how to get around that. One is called jogless stripes and the other is called helical knitting. Helical knitting? I can never pronounce that word. If I can find a tutorial that I like, I'll put up links in the description bar down below. Aside from that, what I wanted to chat about is what you can use stripes for. Aside from the obvious, in that, you can knit stripes. There are a couple of other techniques that stripes are actually the basis of. The first is color blocking. You can knit a piece that has very, very large segments of color. So what you do with those is you switch colors and you join on the new yarn like I showed you, But in those cases, when you're working with really, really long stripes, it's usually best to cut the old yarn. Don't bother carrying it up the side because it's not really going to save you that much time or effort, and you're only really going to have one extra end to weave in, so it's best to just cut it, especially if you're not using that color for another color block later in the pattern. Also, stripes are really helpful for gradients. There are a couple of different methods for doing gradients, but one of the handiest or easiest to do is by making a striped segment between two larger segments of color. So let's say I have a gradient and it's going from color A to color B as its first two sections. What you do is you knit a large block of color A, and then you knit stripes of color A and color B mixed together for a little while, and then you start on just the color B section. And that little stripy bit in the middle is how you get a sort of faded look between the two colors. So you don't have a hard cutoff from the first color to the second color. You've got this section where the colors look like they're sort of merging together because you've made stripes of the two colors blended together. And then the last technique that I use it a lot for, which is the whole point of these videos, is for slip stitch and mosaic knitting, which we will cover in a lot more detail later. So I will leave that for then. So I hope this was helpful and that you learned something. If you do end up making any projects that have stripy sections to them, let me know because I'd really love to see them. You can tag me on Instagram. I'm at OliphantCat, or you can leave a comment down below to let me know where you can find your projects. And make sure if you would like to see more videos to like and subscribe. I put up new videos every Thursday evening. And so it was nice to chat to you about this, and I will definitely see you next week with the first part of the tutorial on how to actually do slip stitch color work. But until then, happy knitting!